from Winter Garden, Florida. It's about 20 minutes from the Magic Kingdom, and yes, every night I can hear the fireworks from my bedroom. Today I'm going to provide a primer on Disney's worlds, focusing on influences, common themes, primarily through the environment of Main Street USA, and I will end with the iconic castles. I'm going to turn off my video before we start. And Jonathan, all I see is a phone. I don't see my slides anymore.
Well, if necessary, I can pull up your slides and advance them for you.
Fantastic.
Maybe double tap or try something like that if you would like.
I can share. This is fun.
I'll pull up your slides in the meantime if we need to pull them up on
the
side.
Okay. All right. There we go. Right? Here we are.
Yeah, we see it.
Excellent. Okay. So Disneyland, and I'm going to talk, I have most of my experiences obviously with the Magic Kingdom. I've never been to Disneyland. I would love to, but when I'm referencing specifically Disneyland, you will know. Otherwise, assume I'm relating to the Magic Kingdom. So Disneyland is the end product of a lifetime of experiences, memories, and influences on Walt Disney. According to Disney scholar Michael Sorkin, World's Fairs featured 4 kinds of attractions that Disney would integrate to perfection: amusement parks and rides, stage set representations of vernacular architecture, state-of-the-art technology, and a special construction of an ideal urban community. So our first great inspiration comes from the 1893 Chicago's World Columbian Exposition. The fair was an archetype for what a city should be: well-planned and beautiful, influencing the City Beautiful movement and making a lasting impact on how we plan for our cities. The World Fair used monumental architecture to control the flow of people and the social environment. Disney's Main Street USA employs this method with use of vernacular small-town architecture, which guides or controls guests toward the center of the park. The scale of Disneyland's architecture is very different from the Magic Kingdom. Disneyland's buildings, which Phil will talk about more, are at a 3/4 inch scale on the first floor and 5/8 on the second floor, whereas the buildings at the Magic Kingdom are monumental in size and over the top. The architecture of the World's Fair also influenced the behavior of guests. Beautiful, romantic, and high-styled architecture implied that the exposition portion of the fair required manner and etiquette. Similarly, Main Street USA sets the tone for Disney's park through its nostalgic architecture. Guests are reassured that this is a place to leave the real world behind. Oh, let me go back. Sorry. I have a picture of Elias Disney's window on Main Street USA. It's the Chicago World's Fair is even more significant to Walt Disney because his father was one of 4,000 men to construct the White City. It's worth noting that all buildings on Main Street USA are outlined by white lights, modeled after the Westinghouse light bulb, which debuted at the World's Fair. And all of the streetlights are patterned after lights that lined main streets in the early 20th century. At the beginning of the park, you start with gas lamps, and then as you make your way toward the castle, the electric light becomes the predominant source. And that's to show the transition between at the turn of the century. The second and third great influences were the New York and San Francisco World's Fairs. As you can see, the image on the left is an aerial of the New York Fair. And I think we can all agree that the design and layout of Epcot Center is probably worth a whole webinar in and of itself when you compare it to the New York World Fair. But Disney didn't actually attend the New York World Fair. He did, however, attend the San Francisco Exposition. The postcard on the right shows you some images from and renderings from the exposition, and it featured turrets, castles, palaces, and towers. The fair also featured new technology like the trackless train by Greyhound. It debuted at the World's Fair in 1939, and Disney was more than inspired by this technology, and it becomes the first ride of the day at Disney World out of the parking lot. To make Disney's dream of Disneyland a reality, he employed 3 broad themes: nostalgia for the past, hope for the future, and the perception of utopia. At Disneyland, the past, and Disney World, the past is a commodity. Guests are paying for an American experience at both parks. Attractions like the Jungle Cruise, Frontierland, or Main Street USA present a white, middle-class version of American history the way we wish it had happened, conflict-free, accompanied by a catchy theme song. The buildings on Main Street USA developed from Walt's childhood memories of Marceline, Missouri, which Phil will discuss more, but they aren't replicas of these buildings. Disney decided to improve upon the image of Main Street to create a space as it should have been. In preservation practice, this is best illustrated by the French architect Viollet-le-Duc. Second Empire architecture was specifically selected for Main Street USA because Disney felt it depicted America's innocence and helped establish the ideal frame of mind when you enter the park. Architecture becomes the facade that creates the impression that all was right in the world at the turn of the century, which we certainly know is not true, but it has become part of our collective memory that these were the good old days. And perhaps the most powerful feature of Main Street USA, and in some ways the most nostalgic, is consumption. The consumer culture is familiar to us, and Main Street USA is the mecca for which you can buy treats, buy souvenirs, etc. It defines the landscape, and it's something all guests have memories of. Everybody has a memory of buying something, especially from Disneyland or World. Hope for the future. So obviously the most literal example is found in Tomorrowland. The future here is never a defined time. Originally, guests experienced the essence of the future and examples of new innovations presented through big corporations like General Electric. Googie architecture and space-age details defined the original landscape. And for me, perhaps the most recognized example of a futuristic invention and delight to children of all ages is the monorail. I remember as a 5-year-old seeing the monorail on my first trip to Disney World. And on the ride from the transportation and parking area to the Magic Kingdom, all I could think was, it can't possibly get any better than this. This amazing thing is taking me to magic. Interestingly, the monorail is clearly visible on Main Street USA, but you'd probably miss it every time you went. The presence of the monorail embodies the hopeful image of a future that might never come, along with the present trip back to the parking lot, all while standing in a past that never existed. Finally, we have perception of utopia. The perception of utopia works hand in hand with nostalgia. Idealizing and flat out ignoring the ugly truth of the American past creates an American utopia, according to Disney scholar Alan Bryman. It is the America we wished existed, and the landscape gets warped into the collective memory, such that we start to think it did exist and could exist again. Because time stands still on Main Street USA and Disney in general, the environment is pristine, from the buildings to the road. Clean lines and manicured landscapes are romantic notions of small town life. Here again, the nostalgia we experience enhances the utopian aspects of the landscape because we believe these ideal conditions existed. Disney is a friendly environment. The civility of Disney workers is a utopian aspect and a welcome escape from the real world. Here you can walk the streets without fear of being attacked, hurt, or robbed. And finally, Main Street USA gives the illusion of place and casts guests as citizens in the small town. Main Street USA has a mayor, a barbershop quartet, and women demonstrating for the right to vote. The civic buildings that carry out functions similar to their prototypes, like Town Square, is the Sun Bank. City Hall provides guests with park information, and the Chamber of Commerce is where you can pick up some of the things that you purchased in the various lands. This is your town. So what might all this mean for historic main streets? Should main streets look to Disney? No, probably not, but there are some common design features that we can emulate or learn from. Real Main Street communities, even the best ones, are not perfect places. And of course, the buildings on your small town street are not homogenized into one style. Disney doesn't have to apply for an architectural review board and wait for a board meeting and then get approval before making any changes to their facades. Disney's Main Street USA also gives the perception that business is always booming. This is a place that's busy and people should be out buying things all the time. That's not even close to attainable on a historic main street. These communities are always working to bring new businesses to empty storefronts and retain old ones. Perhaps the most important thing about Main Street is its landscape. Historic main streets witnessed history. The buildings have a story to tell, and it's important to interpret that history for the public. It's not just the historic commercial district. It's the center of a civil rights protest. It's the parade, the Christmas parade that is so important to your community. It's these stories that get lost in our historic main streets sometimes. And finally, it's important for historic main streets to realize that the image of Main Street is a convolution of the real and the imagined. In many ways, the imagined or romantic ideas surrounding the landscape are now part of the real history of the place. So there are design elements that are often incorporated into our historic Main Street communities, like lampposts, brick pavers, and awnings, because in a desire to label these spaces as important, preservationists and planners have simplified and prioritized features that appeal to the idealized past. These aren't bad things, but it's important to recognize that your Main Street might not have had a beautiful street lamp right on the corner of 5th and Main. But the people visiting your Main Street communities now might expect that. And as you leave Main Street USA, at least, and I'm assuming this happens in Disneyland, you hit the castles. So Sleeping Beauty's castle was inspired by the Neuschwanstein, and I'm sorry, I probably butchered that, castle in Bavaria. It was built for Ludwig II of Bavaria and is a 19th century Romanesque revival palace. It is fondly called the Fairy Tale Castle, and it is pictured on the left. The center drawing is the conceptual drawing for what Walt referred to as the castle. At some point, it became Sleeping Beauty's, but that date is unknown. The castle, which opened in 1955, is 77 feet tall and utilizes forced perspective with where the upper floors appear larger. It's certainly a classic and an icon for the Disney empire, but in my opinion, it's not quite the icon that is Cinderella's castle. Cinderella's castle opened in 1971 and was inspired by the existing Sleeping Beauty's castle, as well as Fontainebleau and Versailles, to name a few. The castle, designed in the Romantic Gothic Revival style, is 189 feet tall, from the bottom of the moat to the top of the tallest spire, more than 100 feet higher than its predecessor. The Gothic Revival style features pointed arches around doors and windows, vaults, tall, narrow windows, often stained glass, and towers. Cinderella's castle features 27 towers, with gargoyles surrounding the spires. Even though the exterior facade suggests it, there were actually no bricks used in the construction, as the inner structure is steel-braced frame, and most of the exterior is a thick, very hard, fiber-reinforced gypsum plaster. My favorite experience going through the castle from Main Street, USA, is to walk through the handmade mosaics, which are in the top right picture, and you walk through vaulted ceiling, and the mosaics show Cinderella's story in Gothic framed arches. It's really beautiful. And finally, the Florida Division of Historical Resources reached out to the executives at Disney to encourage the listing of Cinderella's castle on the National Register. A case can certainly be made for criteria A, B, and C. For criteria A, there's a case for events that have significant contribution to broad patterns of history. And we all know the castle is certainly entrenched in a collective American experience and memory. The legacy of Walt Disney would potentially satisfy criteria B, and criteria C for architecture and engineering makes perfect sense. Although under 50 years old, the Division of Historical Resources hopes to achieve listing prior to the 50th anniversary of the Magic Kingdom in 2021, and I'm hopeful that Disney will be open to this idea. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to turn it back over.
Okay, great. I think you're up, Phil, so feel free to start loading your slides when you're ready.
Okay. Is this visible?
Yes, it looks great.
Fantastic. So thanks, Jeanette. This presentation really follows on a lot of what Jeanette was already discussing, and in particular the theme of nostalgia and maybe moving a little bit more closely into some of the design tactics that Disney provided in the 1950s. And returning to Main Street, I think is really important, in part because it exemplifies so much of what the Disney parks are all about. I mean, of course, there's been different eras that have been represented other than, say, just the late 19th and early 20th century at Disneyland, but Main Street really crystallized a lot of the ideas, and Jeanette began to talk about some of those. And in particular, the idea of creating an environment that is scaled down to our comfort to make us feel at least willing and open in terms of perhaps opening our wallets and moving into the stores and purchasing the goods inside. And that's something that was very effective, continues to be very effective at Disneyland, and has, I think, been influential for how we often see what our downtowns could be. And in some cases, our downtowns here in the United States anyway, in fact, are. To go back a bit first, this is one of several aerial views of Disneyland as it was essentially under construction. This is right about the time of opening day in 1955, and I think it's many of us know the park was not completely finished the day it opened, but many of the main pieces were in place. And this and other aerial views of Disneyland shortly after its opening are really quite striking. And they show the park and the environment around it, the context around it, in quite striking kinds of views when we can see some of the orange groves, for example, up in the upper left-hand corner of this particular slide where I've got the arrows labeling them. It's fairly obvious, but they're still there. At least a few of them are still there. The parking lot at the bottom of the photograph and this is the early incarnation of the parking lot that's grown since then, has taken some orange groves away, but others are still there. And I think we can get a sense that in years to come, those will no longer be around. Something else I think quite important when we look at a view like this is the freeway. The freeway Interstate 5 that we can see in the upper right-hand corner with the Cloverleaf Interchange. This was all known by Disney, that is the implementation and the arrival of that freeway. He had consultants that helped him site the park where it is located in Southern California, in Anaheim, that at the time, and really to some degree still today, is more or less equidistant from the population centers of Los Angeles on the one hand and San Diego on the other, although of course it's one enormous urban and suburban continual environment today, but locating it there was quite strategic so that Disney could capture the most amount of passing traffic coming along in the automobiles that many people had in this post-war period. So quite strategic in terms of the planning, and in the context of the post-war period with the space race, with the automobiles, the freeways, the suburbs, the sprawl, the shopping malls, the split-level ranch homes. This was an environment that actually Disney was not particularly fond of. He certainly capitalized on it, but not necessarily the kind of image that he wanted to convey, the image that he wanted people to enjoy. He didn't feel that this was a world, that is the post-war American world that he was living in. It was not necessarily the world that he thought was amenable to human comfort and their desire for a particular type of world. And so when he designs, or has others design, the park, he designs it around that central spine that Jeanette was talking about, Main Street USA, and the arrow is pointing directly down that central spine, which is a throwback, yes, to the World's Fairs, going back even earlier to Baroque sorts of plans, perhaps Sixtus V's Rome, or Haussmann's Paris, or Versailles, and creating the entire park to focus and funnel directly onto that street. Of course, as we know, it's the first place you encounter, at least the only street place that you go into, and it's the only place that you can leave from as well. So creating everything around this spine, a very traditional kind of environment here, and one that cars, suburbs, freeways were not allowed in Disneyland, of course. And so it's a pedestrian-oriented spine, Main Street USA. So despite the world that Disney felt was fairly chaotic on the outside of the park, inside the park, we would have this extraordinarily comfortable environment where we walked, where there was no motorized transportation, at least in terms of what was around the park at that time, that chaotic world he didn't want. Instead, he wanted something such as this. This is another photograph from the 1950s and shortly after the park opened, where we can see the type of architecture that he was interested in this case, Victorian, that term very loosely to encompass a broad range of styles looking back to the past, in some cases both medieval and classical, depending upon how it was being applied. But importantly as well, this is a walkable environment. It's a view looking back to a 19th century idealized or early 20th century idealized commercial street, perhaps in the United States, as Disney imagined it, a horse-drawn streetcar, so again, no motorized transportation, and then the pedestrians presumably enjoying the day's news and sharing ideas and thoughts, maybe gossip with their neighbors, perhaps as it always used to be. This is what Disney was after in this respect. What he wanted to model that street on is this, and Jeanette mentioned this, but I would talk about this a little bit. This is a postcard of Marceline, Missouri in the 1920s. This is where Disney spent some of his early years, and Disney imagined this town where he grew up in as a civilized kind of place. He wanted to model then Disneyland after this place as he had remembered it, a small town, tight-knit feel, mixed-use buildings where people strolled and got along and enjoyed a sense of community. Now, the reality, I think, as we all know, was likely a little bit different. This postcard already shows some of that. It's not quite as organized maybe as Disney would have liked, but he remembered it being quite organized, efficient, and congenial. Not so much the telephone poles, not so much the hot and dusty street. It's not even paved in this particular view, and we would imagine that in the wintertime it would have been fairly cold, obviously, and muddy and slippery and so on. Not necessarily a chaotic place, but not exactly the perfectly ordered kind of city that Disney would have wanted. So the reality of urban life in Marceline, Missouri might have been different, but that hardly mattered to Disney. It was important once he begins to design Disneyland that you were not going to encounter the world as it actually was outside the gates or had been in actuality. You would encounter it as you imagined it would be if everything could be just as you desired it. And this may be why Disney chose to call his designers Imagineers, because of course they could imagine exactly what Disney desired, and they continue to do that today. And this imagination realized immediately in the train station. The train station is the first building really that everyone encounters once they enter the park. Disneyland, in this case, the Disneyland Resort is the name of it today. Disneyland originally in Anaheim. After you pass through the ticket booths, then you come to the train station. Now for Disney, the train station or the railroad station would help to create a specific kind of mood, a refined existence, a beautiful and detailed building with its, again, the turn of the last century architecture, late 19th, early 20th century. That is in terms of its Victorian styles. And I say styles in plural because it's borrowing from a whole range of different periods. I've got a number of arrows pointing to certain elements, whether the finials or the sash windows, or the mansard roof, or the brick masonry, or the quoins, and so on. But the idea is that the building is bringing us into a particular kind of mood and a particular time and place to help mitigate the effects, on the one hand, of the world that you had just left, that suburban, sprawling, chaotic, freeway-oriented world, and into something that might be much more, should we say, pleasant and maybe even happy. You might see the railroad itself, of course, an industrial machine, but not necessarily in the way that Disney envisioned it. A scaled down railroad, of course, this miniaturized steam puffing machine here, but mitigated by the Victorian architecture, the small scale. The railroad seems to fit, even in this case, with the buildings and with what you will experience shortly thereafter at Main Street. So everything is being mitigated through design. This is not the first time that designers have tried to ensure that we felt comfortable around industry, that we felt comfortable around engineering and power, for example. We can see this happening in any number of examples. We could look, for example, and Disney was not necessarily looking at this. This is simply an example. He may have known about it. This, we see the extraordinary iron rail shed that W.H. Barlow designed, an engineer in the 1860s in London, one of the early train sheds, and an extraordinary engineering feat, and yet not necessarily the image that the city of London, for example, wanted to place on the world, did not want the public necessarily to always see its industrial prowess. It was not the principal sort of image that it wanted to convey in the center. So a few years after that, to vastly oversimplify a rather complex situation, that Sir George Gilbert Scott, the architect, designs the Midland Grand Hotel, which we can see in the foreground of the view in the lower right, to shield the iron vaulting and the trains from view, quite intentionally so, and its extraordinary high Victorian architecture, which is still there today, blocking from view that train station from the center of the city. The high Victorian mode seemingly far more desirable, even though, of course, industry and power and the railroads and the Industrial Revolution is helping London and England become a colonial and imperial power in the 19th century. The Disneyland Railroad Station, having presented this idea, is not exactly the Midland Grand Hotel in London. It's obviously scaled down, and this particular viewpoint doesn't show precisely the same kind of idea working, and yet it's similar. We see the parking. This is another early photograph. The parking lot there, as the cars are filling up, as folks are coming into Disneyland. This may be on opening day. But nonetheless, the idea that you do not see and you do not experience that world of parking and traffic and freeways once you get in the park. That the railroad station, even the railroad itself, has helped to mitigate that, the effect of the world out there. It's a different way of understanding a kind of mitigation. I've labeled this particular slide the past, the rapidly disappearing past, I suppose, of the orange groves. This is looking a different direction than we saw earlier. The present, which is very much the automobiles, and then as Disney is suggesting, not just looking back to the past with the railroad station, but suggesting a kind of future, that is a future past that makes us feel a little bit more comfortable through design. If we look at a couple of examples here, this is the Main Street Cinema. We can look at this in terms of how Disney is trying to make us feel a little bit more comfortable. Main Street Cinema has been showing, or at least up until a few months ago, from what I understand, has been showing Steamboat Willie for forever. But now it's apparently a store. But nonetheless, this is an example of some of these ideas that Jeanette was talking about in terms of bringing us down to scale, making us feel more comfortable, but also that I've been talking about as well. In terms of its style, we might classify this as an Italianate type of structure with its keystone and its arches and its projecting cornice. And by the way, this building perhaps, and certainly some others on Main Street USA, were not designed necessarily by Disney, but by Harper Goff, who was one of his early Imagineers, who came from Fort Collins, Colorado, and might have modeled many of the buildings on what Goff remembered from Fort Collins. But whether Goff or Disney, focusing on who designed what or the details of these particular buildings, I think is not quite as important as the collection of the effect of the whole, the streetscape in general, how these buildings work together. Now, something that you may not notice, and Jeanette touched upon this, but in conceptualizing Main Street USA, Disney or Goff didn't necessarily design the buildings as they were or as they would have been in normal American cities, or really any cities for that matter, but they instead provided their own version of this. So they're providing this idea of a forced perspective where the first floor is not quite, but more or less at scale. And then the second stories of these buildings at 5/8 the scale of the first, and there's some debates about exactly the scale and so on, but the idea is that as you get close to the buildings, they appear taller. If you were to really begin to dissect them, you would recognize, all right, they're not quite, there's something a little bit odd about them, but this was entirely the point. Disney was interested in creating a kind of stage set architecture, this forced perspective that he thought would work quite well on a movie set, but importantly would be more amenable to human comfort, because these kinds of buildings would suggest make-believe. People would feel, again, more comfortable around these buildings, not intimidated by architecture, certainly not by industry, and people would want to go inside and purchase the goods being sold there. So as we think of perhaps about this as a whole, in this case, 19th century styles, buildings on a 19th century or early 20th century commercial street, where horse-drawn streetcars are really the only form of moving transport, everything being designed here to enhance the process of consumption. We can think about how this may have been and may continue to be a model for American streets, a model for American downtowns. And I'm not entirely sure that people are always pointing to the Disneyland effect, but it contributed to that. Disney himself and his designers, this is not the first time folks have looked back to the past in terms of design and trying to enhance spaces, not at that time, not in the 1950s, not today. But when you think about this entire process as a whole, all of these ideas and reacting to the suburbanized world that was existing at that time, Disneyland and Main Street USA in particular has been extraordinarily influential over the years. And I think we're still looking to some degree at Main Street USA, or maybe subconsciously thinking about it when we think about what a template might be for ideal American downtowns. So that's all I have, and I'm going to pass the proverbial baton, I guess, on to Caitlin.
Okay, Caitlin, let me know if you need any help, but we're ready when you are.
Okay, let me just share. So it's really interesting listening to these earlier two because then I chose to talk. I have a complete from Main Street. So, you come in to the park comfortable and familiar and kind of reminiscing about your hometown. And then suddenly you, I think, turn left into Adventureland and Frontierland. Buildings and to appeal to the past and nostalgia, whereas Tiki Modern and the Frontier are definitely more, well, they were contemporary to the era when Disneyland first opened and were trendy fads at the time. So, hang on here, I'm looking at.
Caitlin, your sound is breaking up for some reason. I'm not sure if it's your phone or.
All right, I guess it's on my phone, so I'm trying to.
What we could, do you think it's because?
What do you want to do?
Yeah, do you have a low signal on your phone, or is it a cell phone? All right, 1 second. Let's troubleshoot this. So maybe it. Would you like me to share the slides? Do you think the slides?
You're breaking up too.
Oh, I'm breaking up as well. How about we move forward to Sasha, and then Caitlin and I can figure out our sound while Sasha is presenting.
Should I use my computer audio?
Yes, that might help.
I'm gonna do this.
Whoa.
I just muted your phone, but I can hear your computer audio. That's much better.
Okay, I'm gonna turn off the phone then.
Okay, great.
Jeez. Okay. Does that work?
I think we're all squared away now.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, the sound is even better now, so I think we should stick with this option.
Awesome. All right, so everyone can hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. All right, I'll start over a little bit. I was just saying that listening to the earlier two presenters about Main Street is really interesting because I chose to talk about Tiki Modern and the Western frontier styles. And they're like a complete departure from the familiar Main Street that people were meant to visit and feel nostalgic about. Suddenly you then enter Adventureland and Frontierland, and there's this sense of adventure, obviously, but kind of danger and mystery as well. And also the fact that Main Street evoked the past and nostalgia, but things like Tiki Modern style and the Western fads were trendy at the time that Disneyland opened. So you kind of, you're looking at a different aspect of artifice in these two examples. So just to give a background on the style in general, it actually kind of stemmed out of Prohibition, and Dawn's Beachcomber restaurant in Hollywood was is cited as the first tiki bar slash lounge slash restaurant. It opened in 1933, and you know it was a backlash against Prohibition because you could order these frivolous fruity drinks. But it was also kind of uplifting during the Depression. So all these tropical, bright colors, sort of vacation attitude really helped lift people out of the Depression. It became more popular later on when Thor Heyerdahl did his Kon-Tiki expedition, where he built a Polynesian raft and he and a crew sailed it from South America to Polynesia. And he eventually wrote a book about it, and it became a movie, and the public was just wrapped by this adventure. So that entered the public realm and attention. The war came along, and obviously, you know, it was a harrowing experience for many servicemen, but at the same time, they sat in fields with pineapples and had a good time, and a lot of nostalgia is wrapped up in that. So despite the war, the tropical fad kind of latched on and was taken worldwide by all these men who served in the South Pacific, whereas previously it had been kind of a California-based thing. And then James Michener wrote a series of South Pacific stories. It was called Tales of the South Pacific, and it was then adapted into the musical South Pacific, which became a huge deal. So you have it in literature and movies. And then in 1959, Hawaii gained statehood, and kind of America claimed the tropics in that way. And so it continued on from there into the 50s and 60s as just a really popular trend in pop culture, fashion, etc. So, and obviously architecture. So it's interesting because Tiki style is taking a very primitive architectural form and adapting it to buildings that obviously meet the building code and are fairly substantial structures. It was expressed mainly in roof forms, I think. You had these very tent-like A-frames. This one, the Waikikian in Hawaii, Waikiki, they would get these sway-backed roof forms that were often kind of primitive looking, but then they'd also incorporate these parabolic curves, and that really brought in the mid-century modern, and I think ties the Tiki modern style to its mid-century origins. You also had, I call them the Pizza Hut roof form, but Hawaiian hut style roofs with these kind of reverse mansard in a way. And then also conical with kind of pinnacles in the middle. So the roof forms are always very dramatic, and they tried to mimic a hut-like or a tent-like form. And that reflects in the structure too. They were trying to make things look like structures made out of bamboo poles and woven grass walls, things like that. So you'll see a lot of exposed beamwork and structural members. They had these outrigger buttresses that tried to create a lightness, I think, again, to mimic the idea that these were fairly impermanent huts, that they were not substantial in any way. Most of the construction was of wood, but they'd also used lava rock to try to tie into the ground and add another sense of the island materials that would have been used in making huts and other structures. Typically, the lava rock was used in accent walls and planters and things. It was not used as an actual structural material. Mostly, I should mention too that the Tiki Modern style is typically used for commercial establishments, businesses, recreational facilities. You rarely see it in residential design, although this picture on the right is an apartment building. So I think, and you do see that to some extent in Southern California, the beachcomber apartments and things like that of the mid-century, where they'll bring in a little tiki style. And then the best part of tiki, of course, is its decorativeness. You have all these iconic tiki masks and idols and different motifs that were brought in to express the style on the exterior of the building. So, you'll have beam ends that are shaped to look like the prows on a catamaran or a canoe. And signage was big, so you'll have these very bold signs. There were even fonts developed that were somewhat mid-century, but like this one on the Honolulu Hotel that kind of tries to look like bamboo. And even now we look at them and we feel like they are very mid-century, even though they're also pulling in this tropical vibe. And then what I think is interesting about Tiki Style is that it's as much an interior design as it is an exterior. So you will find any tiki bar worth its salt will have a bunch of grass thatch and bamboo and artifacts, canoe paddles, things like that, using the native tapa cloth as wall coverings. And often you'll get water features like a pool or a koi pond or fountains and lots of plants woven in. And what's interesting is you can even have tiki interiors without the exterior. Like this example on the top right is the Tonga Room in San Francisco. And it's actually located inside of a very classical Beaux-Arts hotel, the Fairmont. But this one particular room is all tiki. So as far as Disneyland, the Enchanted Tiki Hut, or Enchanted Tiki Room, is kind of the main thing I think of when I think of the Tiki style. And it definitely did the interior and exterior thing very well. I remember going as a kid and you would be there at 2 o'clock on a sunny Southern California afternoon, and you stepped into that room and suddenly it was midnight on a dark, drippy tropical island. So that ability to transport you in atmosphere is really kind of fascinating. Adventureland's main gates are tiki style, setting the tone for the rest of the area. And then on the upper right is the Tahitian Terrace, which was the original food service area for Adventureland. And they would have hula dancers and Hawaiian, fire eaters, and along with Hawaiian barbecue, and kind of all themed to that. It was actually replaced at one point with an Aladdin themed restaurant that went Middle Eastern theme, like architecturally. But most recently they've turned it into the Tropical Hideaway, which you see at the bottom left. And they are back to the tiki torches and the grass roofs. So it's definitely an architectural style that's coming back or has made a resurgence. I think it died a little in the 70s and 80s, although I don't know, Hawaii 5-0 was big. I was looking at all the the lists of movies and TV shows, and like it did persist, but it died off a bit. And now we have the resurgence of the tiki bar, and kind of retroism really pulls in that tiki vibe. So, and then my next bit is on the Frontierland and its frontier architecture. The main one of these is the Western false front style. And I think where tiki was purely a mid-20th century trend, the appeal of the Western dates back pretty much to the point when the Western frontier opened, and there's always been a romance about it. You know, it was another piece of history and another environment that was full of optimism, but also a bit of mystery. What's out there? What are we going to find? Are we going to strike it rich? And danger, obviously. So you get the same sense of like excitement and risk going into Frontierland that you did going into Adventureland. Okay, so yeah, obviously this, like, there's a picture of Bodie, California, the ghost town in the upper left. So we still have vestiges of this architecture and this environment out there, and it's still a place that you go and have this sense of curiosity about, you know, what was life like back then? Why is this town here? What happened to it? So there's that sense of mystery that drives all of this. And culture revolving around the Western style has always been very big. We have Frederick Remington's art, the literature of Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour and writers like that. There was the Lone Ranger radio series that then became a TV serial and has become movies since then. Same with Davy Crockett, which is actually a Disney production with Fess Parker and his coonskin cap. It was a mini series that became a movie, and you know, it worked its way into fashion even. Print shirts and gingham and bandana prints and having plackets and pearl buttons, and even the wearing of jeans became much more mainstream and popular with the whole Western, mid-century Western fad. But the buildings themselves, I'm going to talk about false front buildings first. It was all about impressions and the idea that in the frontier, you didn't have much to work with. You built very modest structures, square or rectangular, typically only 1 story, maybe 2 stories high. But you put these false fronts on them to make them look like large, well-established, substantial commercial buildings. So again, you get that artifice, but kind of in the reverse from Tiki. Tiki was meant to look insubstantial, while false front was trying to look more substantial. Because you were in these frontier towns, they were struggling, they were, you know, running off the nearby mine, but you wanted it to look like Main Street USA that you came from, perhaps. So, and in that sense, you know, they were frontier buildings. They had their own aesthetic, but they were built during the Victorian era. So they tried to pull in the decorative motifs that you see in more well-established Victorian buildings, especially in the cornice at the top. There was always usually some sort of finishing segments with brackets or moldings that kind of topped the building. You'd have usually wood construction, although sometimes there was brick or stone. And if there wasn't, sometimes they would use wood or things like pressed tin to mimic brick or stone. So it was all that impression. You're trying to make an impression of being much more well-established than the building that was thrown up overnight and moved into by a bunch of pioneers. They would sometimes incorporate decorative shingle work occasionally. Tall, narrow windows, which were a Victorian norm, were also used in false front buildings. And those would have trim and corner blocks and hoods, little cornice hoods and things. And I think what's interesting too is because you had this huge expanse of parapet up at the top of your facade, it was like a built-in billboard. So just the way that signage is fairly important in tiki architecture, signage becomes important in false front as well, because it's kind of an integral part of the building. It's all about expressing what your business was and bringing people in. And then I kind of also looked at like some other offshoots of frontier building. One was wilderness forts, because, you know, Davy Crockett was huge, and it was all about the cowboys and Indians and that sense of needing defense and a fort, which is also really appealing to small children. So that would have been log architecture. You would have had these towers for defense, tall palisades with large gates. And because you didn't want people getting in, you had very few windows and no ornament, because who had gingerbread out in the frontier, out in the middle of nowhere? And the other was mining camps or mine buildings, which were often rambling, multi-level, just kind of conglomerates of structure just to serve the purpose of processing ore. They were built, but both of these styles were built with materials that were either easily accessible in the wilderness or could be purchased and shipped via railroad. So you just get roughly milled boards in the mine buildings, and sheet metal occasionally if you could get it, to reduce fire risk. But I think one of the most distinctive things as, in the mine buildings is chimneys and gantries and like rail trestles and things that serve the purpose of the mine, but they kind of let you know what the building does functionally. So at Disneyland, you see that example of the mine buildings in the lower left at Thunder Mountain, which is the whole ride's based on sitting in an ore car and going through all the tracks. But they definitely have incorporated the building. I think you go through parts of the building in the ride, and you know, it's the typical rambly shacks, and you've got the rail trestles and the chimneys and all that. And the entrance to Frontierland is the fort, the Davy Crockett Fort, with the palisades and the towers. So that's represented. I think there might be some of that on Tom Sawyer's Island too, but and then obviously the kind of, not the main street, but the shop area of Frontierland has all the it's the little town. So it has the false fronts, and I think they go a little more decorative and verge more on the Victoriana, but they've got that concept of the tall parapets and the signage on the front. And even the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, which would probably be what most little Western towns would aspire to as far as being a bigger Italianate facade. But that's kind of the anchor of the whole area, and ties into the whole Western feel. So I think that's it for mine.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. We will now be moving to Sasha. So when you're ready, Sasha, you can load up your slides.
Great, thank you so much. I will do that now. Okay, great. So let's get started here. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank the California Preservation Foundation for inviting me to participate today on in this webinar. And I'd like to actually start off by explaining why I'm here, because I'm actually not a historian of architecture and design. If you've ever been to Disneyland, you've definitely noticed the presence of the past at the park, and this is a big theme of today's webinar. Walt Disney himself commented on his intent to reproduce the past at Disneyland during his dedication speech in July 1955. On the day that Disneyland opened, Walt talked about the possibilities and promises of his new theme park in Anaheim, California. He told guests, "Disneyland is dedicated to the ideals, the dreams, and the hard facts that have created America, with the hope that it will be a source of joy and inspiration to all the world." Now, the food, rides, designs, and characters at the Disney parks clearly have rich historical roots, but you've probably noticed that Disney itself does little to interpret that history. So that's why in 2017, I created the EnchantedArchives.com, or EA for short. The mobile-friendly website offers a library of short posts that describe the histories behind what you see, hear, and taste at the Disney parks. On this side, you'll see a small selection of EA library entries related to Disneyland. My goal with the project is to offer a new layer of storytelling, one that adds some texture to the landscape and diversifies the voices represented at the park. Part of what you've learned from today's webinar is how Disney does such a good job of transporting park guests to different times and places. The parks offer immersive environments that are just not possible without careful attention to architectural detail. During my portion of the webinar, I want to use the Disney parks to introduce you to the main features of 3 architectural and design movements. The first is Art Deco. Now, the term Art Deco refers to an aesthetic that emerged in the years between World War I and World War II. The Art Deco movement influenced everything from gas stations and hotels to jewelry, posters, furniture, films, toys, and appliances. Scholars generally agree that the Art Deco movement began in 1925 after a famous art exhibition held in Paris that year. Now, interestingly, the phrase Art Deco was not in use until the 1960s. People living in the 1920s and 30s used other labels like zigzag or moderne to describe what they were seeing. This terminology, I think, speaks to major transformations occurring during the interwar period. Innovations in lighting and transmission made electricity more widely accessible. Automobiles, steamships, radio towers, and other inventions allowed people to quickly connect with one another, even when separated by long distances. And corporations produced goods at a faster rate due to factory improvements. Mass migrations from rural to urban areas accompanied these major technological advancements. Many people living in the 1920s and 30s truly felt like they had entered a modern age where life moved at a much faster pace than it did before. The features of the Art Deco movement reflected this new context. The most common colors you'll see are warm tans and shades of green with brilliant touches of red, cobalt blue, and golden yellow. Designs often incorporated shiny metal accents of steel, bronze, nickel, and platinum. Buildings installed lighting in strategic places to create dramatic shadows. Metallic threads, bold costume jewelry, and geometric patterns became popular features of clothing. Now, it's important for us to note here that international influences were an integral component of Art Deco. In the early to mid 20th century, European powers had colonies all over the world. And colonial exploration combined with tourism impacted designers and artists. They embraced styles from Asia, Greece, Rome, Aztec and Mayan civilizations, and probably most famously, ancient Egypt, especially after the excavation of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Now, if you look at this photo, you'll see a sample of the Art Deco designs you'll find in Hollywoodland, located in Disney's California Adventure Park. This part of California Adventure uses Art Deco to recall old Hollywood, or Hollywood's golden age of the 1920s and 1930s. Art Deco used to be the defining motif of the Tower of Terror attraction at California Adventure, and still is for that attraction at Walt Disney World. Art Deco also manifests itself at California Adventure in other ways too, and I will get to that in a minute. The worldwide economic depression that hit in the late 1920s led to a serious re-examination of art and design. The elaborate ornamentation of Art Deco and the relatively expensive materials of Art Deco construction did not make much sense during this period of economic uncertainty and contraction. In the United States, streamlined moderne became more prevalent. Now, Art Deco and streamlined moderne shared a lot of characteristics, but the latter took a much simpler approach. Designers and architects started using inexpensive, easily replaceable materials like white cement, stucco, glass brick, and linoleum floors. The 1930s was also the heyday of transatlantic ocean liners, so many of the bus terminals, gas stations, drive-in restaurants, movie theaters, and event venues were built with ship details like small round windows, metal railings, and portholes. Art Deco and streamlined moderne both remained popular throughout the 1930s, thanks in part to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program, which hired architects, sculptors, and painters to build and create art for town halls, zoos, prisons, post offices, and airport terminals all over the country. Now, I want to tell you a story about one streamlined moderne building in particular, and that's the Pan Pacific Auditorium. This 100,000 square foot venue was built in Los Angeles, California in the 1930s. The Pan Pacific hosted many notable performances during its lifetime, including Elvis. It closed in the 1970s once the Los Angeles Convention Center was finished. Bulldozers eventually got to the Pan Pacific in 1992, but this iconic structure still lives on at the entrances to Disney's Hollywood Studios in Walt Disney World and Disney's California Adventure Park. Now you know that these 4 teal towers and white flagpoles above the California Adventure turnstiles offer us a window into a rich history of a famous art movement with a worldwide impact. Now, I could really talk all day about Art Deco and streamlined moderne, but I want to leave time for one of the most iconic structures at Disneyland, the Haunted Mansion. When Disney Imagineers started planning what would eventually become New Orleans Square at Disneyland, they did research in the library and traveled to the American South to seek out local legends, ghost stories, and architectural examples. Art director and animator Ken Anderson took the lead in drawing up the plans for a haunted house to anchor this new part of Disneyland. Scholars, bloggers, and official Disney histories point to the Shipley house as the most direct model for the Haunted Mansion's exterior. Constructed in Baltimore City, Maryland in 1803, the house was purchased by a carpenter and real estate operator named Charles Shipley in 1851, and he sold the property to Philip Ledecker in 1906. At the time, the striking 3-story, 20-room house caught the attention of several observers. One described the home as, quote, the quaintest, the most absurd, and the most picturesque dwelling in Baltimore. The Shipley Ledecker House is a great example of the Greek Revival architectural movement that spanned the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In both urban and rural settings, Americans ornamented residences, churches, courthouses, academic buildings, plantation houses, and government buildings, including both the White House and the US Capitol, with columns, pediments, and porticos that looked a lot like those from the Athenian Acropolis and other ancient structures. Archaeologists helped spread this fascination with Greek antiquity. They traveled to Greece and Italy, visited ruins, and wrote about what they found in books and articles, which then found their way into libraries and bookstores. The primary features of Greek Revival buildings include columns made of white marble or wood and just painted to look like white marble, a pediment or a triangular structure at the front of the building that is supported by columns, balconies with iron railings at each level, and an entrance vestibule, or a chamber connecting the exterior door to the building's interior. Now, Greek revival is one of my absolute favorite topics because historians disagree so passionately about why exactly this design became so prominent in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, one popular thesis has to do with industrialization. Greek revival could have been a response to this moment of perceived chaos when the population of many American cities was exploding. Architects designed buildings reminiscent of ancient Greece because they admired the perceived order and stability of that society. Another line of reasoning focuses on why Southern slave owners embraced it in particular. Some argue that white Southerners adorned their plantation houses with columns and porticos to justify slavery as an honorable and just institution stretching all the way back to ancient Greece, arguably the most famous democracy. Others suggested that plantation owners adopted the Greek revival style not to make a political statement about slavery, but more to just convey their fashionable taste. It's possible that all of these factors played a role. To wrap up, I'd like to just briefly report on next steps for the Enchanted Archives. I'm currently working on a digital map that can identify a guest location based on your smartphone location and deliver content relevant to where the user is in Disneyland. I'm also making more additions to the library, and I'm just absolutely inspired by the other presentations I've heard today. And will be totally honest, I'm going to ask all of them to contribute to the site if they would. I'm also in the middle of creating additional walking tours of the Disney parks, expanding into fields outside of history, and also pursuing funding for a standalone cell phone app. So if you have any questions or would like to get involved in any way, please connect with me. You can find my email address and social media handle on this slide. This has been really fun. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Sasha. That was a wonderful presentation. So I will be closing out, and just a heads up to everybody, it looks like we might be ending around 1:30 or around 1:30 today, but we will continue the conversation after 1:30. You're more than welcome to stay around for the discussion. So with that being said, I'm gonna very quickly move over to my presentation, and I'll try to get through this quickly. Now, when each of us chose the attractions that we wanted to speak about, I thought it obvious that, I hope everybody can see my screen now, is that right? Okay, 1 second here. I thought it would be obvious that I would choose Route 66 because our organization has been involved since around 2011 in efforts to document and record the sites of Route 66. Now, there are a number of architectural styles represented in Radiator Springs, which is the attraction at Cars Land that we'll be discussing today. Everything from Quonset Huts to neon lighting to Art Deco again. And we're going to go over these quickly. And I wanted part of this presentation to be a little interactive. But first, to sort of set the stage with everything here, just to go over the layout of Radiator Springs. It was the largest piece of a 5-year expansion at California Adventure. It was 12 acres. And it was inspired when John Lasseter was meeting with a woman by the name of Angel Delgadillo, who founded the historic Route 66 Association, and who was firsthand trying to protect the sites of Seligman, Arizona. And as a boy, John Lasseter grew up in Whittier, California, which many of you may know is part of Route 66. And he loved to visit the Chevrolet dealership where his father worked. So he was a big car lover. And around the time that they started production for the movie Cars, which eventually became a Pixar production, Lasseter went along with his team to Oklahoma City and drove in a 4-car caravan along Route 66 back to California. But there's a different kind of history that sort of underlies Route 66, and this goes all the way back to even before the 1920s. You'll notice on the slide here that there are some key migration dates, but those are not by any means the only dates that people traveled along Route 66. They were just times of high activity. The earliest sort of planning process that went into Route 66 was in 1857. This was right before this, Lieutenant Amiel Whipple, he was a soldier and topographical engineer. He was charged with exploring the territory from Fort Smith, Arkansas to Los Angeles, California for a projected transcontinental railroad route. Now with that information, Lieutenant Edward Fitzgerald Beale was appointed by President Buchanan to survey and build more than 1,000-mile wagon route that roughly follows the track of Route 66. And this was followed between 1916 and 1925 with various federal highway acts that added a network of roads that also roughly tracked Route 66. And then in 1926, Route 66 was officially named Route 66, which is what we know it as today. And then what really sort of led to the demise of Route 66, many of us know this story, was in 1956, Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Act basically set into motion a whole series of alternate roads, interstates, that bypassed Route 66. And that's sort of the theme of both the movie and Cars and Radiator Springs. Since 1994, there have been efforts to protect many of the sites along Route 66. We aren't the only organization who has made efforts to record and protect these sites. Every state has their own nonprofit organizations that are doing this. Now, just to make this a little interactive here, I'm going to throw up a poll. So everybody should be looking at a question here. I wanted everybody to guess what architectural style this building here is in Radiator Springs. So go ahead and answer the questions if you see it up on the screen. Okay, I was actually really curious. Let's share the results with everybody. I was curious what you all would think about this style. Now, many of you answered Pueblo Revival, which I could certainly see that with this building, and I would also ask our other speakers to weigh in if they feel one way or another. But the most obvious that showed to me was Mission Revival. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. So the reason I would call this Mission Revival is if you look at the roof structure, they're red clay tile. Often Mission Revival uses plaster or stucco to have in lighter colors. And it was part of a movement in the late 1800s in response to other revivalist movements that were taking on. And it was the first style that actually transferred from the west to the east. It was really picked up by the Santa Fe Railroad and Southern Pacific Railroad when they adopted the style for many of their stations across the country. So some of the details you'll see in Mission Revival are quatrefoil sort of designs that are inspired by Islamic architecture. You see a shallow tile roof, a portico, usually with arches, a parapet that is often resembling the Missions of California, and of course the red clay tile roof. Here are some examples of the train stations along Route 66. One important thing to note is the train preceded the road. So a lot of the route of Route 66 follows the Santa Fe Railroad route. So you'll find a lot of these stations along Route 66 as well. Here's the Santa Fe Railroad station in Las Vegas. And Cucamonga Service Station, which advocates recently restored, also follows along Route 66, and it's a service station that is in the Mission Revival style. Another thing I wanted to talk about were Quonset huts. Now, Quonset huts don't have an obvious style, which is why I'm not quizzing you on it. Some people may call it prefabricated or modular or hut style, but it really found its sort of origins in traditional Iroquois and other types of structures developed by nomadic cultures and tribes. And then when the Industrial Revolution came along, lightweight steel and the innovations that came from the Bessemer process of steel production allowed the mass production of steel structures like this. These were meant largely for war purposes. They say that one could be stored in 12 pallets and assembled in 24 hours, and in as little as 12 hours with a crew of as few as 6 people. So here are some examples of the uses of Quonset huts after the war. Excuse me. You'll also see some examples along Route 66. Now, when the war ended, many of these were packed back into their crates and shipped off and sold at cut rate in government auctions, and they ended up all over the country, many of them on Route 66. Here, what you see here is in Santa Monica, the eponymously named Quonset Trading Post, which was eventually somewhat demolished, half demolished, but a remnant was left in a development that is now a place where you can purchase a burger. So we already have gone over Art Deco, and in the interest of time, I'm just not going to go over the style because Sasha did it very well. But what I will do here is just kind of show you some of these features on Radiator Springs. Now, Sasha went over the history, so I won't do that right now, but it is notable that a lot of Art Deco was inspired by the discovery of these ancient cultures, including the Egyptian and Mayan cultures. And here in the Bay Area, we have a number of examples that are Mayan Deco. Now on Route 66, you'll see that attraction that you saw in the earlier slide was directly inspired by the Conoco station in Shamrock, Texas. Another feature of Art Deco is that there are a lot of floral motifs, and that was also inspired by its predecessor, which was Art Nouveau. So you might see a lot of motifs that look like flowers or even papyrus, and papyrus again was inspired by that Egyptian past. And then finally, the last style I wanted to look at that was from Radiator Springs was the Cozy Cone Motel, and I'm going to quiz everybody on this one as well. Let's pull up the quiz here. Okay, so go ahead and answer what you think this is. Okay, so most of you got it right. That's great. And I did throw in architectural folly in there as a bit of a trick question, because architectural folly are buildings that have no specific purpose. They're just there sort of as a sculptural element, but this is certainly programmatic. So you'll notice that the Cozy Cone itself is programmatic of the previous, it's what it's inspired by, which is itself also a programmatic architecture, which is the wigwam motels, many of which were along Route 66, but not exclusively along Route 66. There were 7 of them. Now there are only, today there are only 3 remaining, all of which are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And one thing about programmatic architecture is probably also why it's called mimetic architecture, is it mimes or resembles things typically in an oversized fashion. So you see giant elephants, giant muffler men, giant donuts, and in this case, teepees. There's a historic photo of the National Register Wigwam Motel in San Bernardino, California, which CPF helped list on the National Register. And finally, before I move it into the question period, I wanted to look at one example from cars that is difficult to define. And this often happens at Disneyland, where they pick pieces, character-defining features of various architectural styles. So there's your belt course of rusticated ashlar, grills or fake muntins. You'll see a corbelled pediment there. A false front parapet. We just saw some of that when during Caitlin's presentation, but this is a brick version of that. Arched lintels and your modillioned cornice. Now, I don't know if I would call those dentils or modillions. I'm sure some of the other architectural historians who've done this much more than me would be able to answer that. And then when we look at the styles for each of these are not always in one style, but they characterize the style. So typically classical revival. I don't know what I would call the grills in this case. They don't follow a particular template, so I'm interested in hearing what the audience thinks. There you have an Italianate feature, which are those brackets that hold up the pediment. Western false front that Caitlin talked a lot about. There's another Italianate feature, which are those arched lintels. And then Sasha's presentation showed us a Greek revival example, and in the photo you may have noticed the dentils or modillions. So now, as I'm closing out in the next minute or two here, I just want to talk about the very real difficult questions that we should be asking as historians about Disney's impact on our culture. And I put the question here, it's a provocative question that we could probably talk more about later, but does Disney really fill a commercial need, or does it exploit our cultural capital, or maybe both? And in the end, who will maintain and invest in the real sites that Disney has been inspired by? Just a few statistics I wanted to point out is since 2001, officially by the government, there's been approximately $2 to $3 million invested, and then another half of that went in cost share matches. So basically, roughly $6 million has been invested in making sure that Route 66 sites are preserved and remain. But Disney brings in $20.3 billion a year most recently, and $1 billion of that goes directly to California, or comes into California Adventure through ticket sales, etc. I really like the drawing here. If you would like to learn more about the artist of this, you can just look up Chandler O'Leary. She does a couple books that wonderful illustrations of different architectural styles along Route 66. And then finally, just the real challenging past of Route 66, which is the fact that much of Route 66 was closed off to Black Americans well into the Civil Rights Act. And it was not a safe road for people. And I encourage everybody to look at that story about the Green Book. And recently a film was made about the topic, but there's a much more complex past to this. And the story in Atlantic, written by Candace Taylor, will go more deeply into the sort of the challenges of Route 66 and what sites we should be protecting and what histories we should be recognizing. And there's your Route 66 route. If I fade into a map of Route 66 with the Jim Crow cities and the sundown towns, you'll notice, I think these are swastikas. They look backwards to me, I'm not familiar. But all the swastika symbols are sundown towns. So there are a few statistics I wanted to point out before we went into discussion. Out of the 8 states that Route 66 ran through, 6 had official segregation laws. And Victor Green, the publisher of the Green Book, intended to help people, Black Americans, navigate the roads through the Green Book, and it reached a circulation of 2 million people by 1962. And in 1930, 44 out of the 89 counties that lined Route 66 were all white communities known as sundown towns. Black travelers also had to travel with portable toilets, bedding, gas cans, ice coolers, often just to avoid the humiliation of having to be turned away at a business. Businesses along Route 66 that had 3 Ks in them. Think Cozy Cottage Camp or Clean Country Cottages. They were code for the Ku Klux Klan, which meant that these establishments only served whites. And even in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where it was a very open, relatively multiracial city, only 6% of more than 100 motels along Albuquerque's slice of Route 66 admitted Black Americans. Candace Taylor, who wrote that story I showed you earlier, estimated that nearly 75% of Green Book sites have been demolished or radically modified, and the majority that remain have fallen into disrepair. So it's crucial to preserve whatever sites are left. With that being said, I'm going to turn over to a moderated panel. Feel free to hang around if you'd like to be a part of this discussion. But for our panelists, I'm going to have you all unmute your audio, and I'll move right into the first question. Okay, so the first question was, and this was developed by one of our speakers, materials are a significant aspect of defining architectural style, but Disney uses a lot of artifice in construction. How does this help or hinder the true expression of various styles? So I think we're going in the order of the presentation. So Jeanette, if you have anything to say on this, let's hear what you have to say.
I'm good on this one.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm happy to weigh in on this. I think it's a great question, and I think it raises so much of what all of us have been talking about to some degree, in that it raises the question, and even though we didn't really talk about it directly, about what constitutes artifice. I mean, if Disney or Disneyland is a place that is thriving on creating a make-believe kind of environment that makes us feel or behave in a particular way, or tries to control us in particular sorts of ways, or bring us back into a particular time period, is that not real? Is that not realistic? I mean, in other words, if the intention of designing something artificially is the intention, and everyone engages in that world, why does that world become artificial? And I suppose I'm extrapolating a little bit on the question, but it does raise this issue about artifice, and also about truth. And that's the second part of the question. How does this help or hinder the true expression of various styles? What then constitutes the truth of these particular styles? Is there a truth to them? Is there a particular period when it was the original? And what was that? I mean, we could, Sasha was talking about the Greek revival, but was that a true style? It was a revival, right? And so we would maybe have to look back to ancient Greece, and even then you'd start asking questions about where are those kinds of ideas coming from. And so it to me, it's really an interesting kind of question about reality versus imagination that I think Disney certainly thrives upon.
Yeah, I had the same kind of take on that idea of layers of revivalism. And the fact that, I did the Tiki and the Frontier stuff, but, Tiki's trying to imitate very primitive construction. It's using substantial materials to imitate insubstantial materials. And for the Frontier, like I was saying, the false front uses insubstantial-ish materials to try to imitate something much more well-established. So Disney is imitating styles that are imitating other things. There's this whole trickle down. And I was thinking about it even with the cozy cones. They're imitating teepees, but the teepees themselves of the motel fame were not actual teepees, so they were imitating something too. So I think Disney's artifice in a way reinforces the idea that architectural styles are often imitating earlier precedents. And the materials aspect is a little bit surface level, but it uses wood to imitate brick or things like that. So ultimately, it's all kind of a theatrical presentation of much earlier things.
And when I originally read this question, I was thinking a lot about composites. So Disney has the benefit of hindsight, and what I mean by that is it gets to kind of take stock of what exists and then create an identifiable composite, but that also has the effect of papering over difference. And so I think that I completely agree with my co-presenters here and what they said, and I would just add that you don't get a real sense of tensions and disagreements and roads less frequently traveled when you look at a Disney structure, because it just suggests that this is the way that it was and that there was only one way. So I think that's one thing that as historians of art and architecture, folks can help us better understand that than Disney can.
Great, thank you. Now, maybe what I'll do before I move into question 2 or 3 is review some of the questions from the people that are in attendance very quickly. We'll answer those, and then we could continue the discussion if we'd like. There was a question about the cozy cone resembling traffic cones, oversized traffic cones rather than wigwams. And wigwams also are probably a misnomer for what those original teepee structures were, because if you know what a wigwam looks like, it isn't a teepee. There is, as we have been discussing, a lot of fuzziness in some of these architectural terms, and Disney sort of exploits that in a way. And then the other question was, why doesn't CPF and other preservationists approach Disney for funds to preserve the authentic history they are mining for profit? I like that question. But similar to Getty, they need to contribute to the Commonwealth. I completely agree with that point. I don't know what our other panelists would say to that. Or they may not.
I don't disagree with it, but Disney is its own little world, and they might not think that or consider that they are, taking history or that they need to tell the full story in their parks. Now, perhaps there could be a way to share these stories and present a bigger picture outside of the Magic Kingdom, but I personally, I don't necessarily have a problem being immersed in fantasy, and I'm okay accepting that this is not real life. This didn't really happen. I don't know if everything needs to be, and I might be being controversial saying this as a preservationist. I don't know that everything needs to have a footnote on it necessarily.
Great, thank you. Any other comments, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, we could do that. There's also some really interesting questions that are appearing up on the chat too, as well. John, I don't know if you wanted to address those, but
how about you pick one, Phil? That way, I'll sort of pass off my moderator duty to you for a second.
Well, and I don't have. I'm in many ways interested in maybe what the panelists think about this as well. Although I think they're muted, but this one from Aaron something, and I just read it here. I'm an historic preservation planner in South Florida. Disney World is less than 3 hours away. Have any of the panelists, either through work or observation, noticed any influences that Disney's creative license with traditional architectural styles has had for new construction within local, state, or national historic districts? I don't have an answer to that question. I'm not sure what Disney has done or has not done in terms of preservation in actual cities, other than their example being followed by cities and so on. Maybe others have an idea about that.
No, I wouldn't know about anything that's directly Disney influenced, but I think there are a number of poor examples in historic districts where, you know, false historicism is used too much, and historic styles are mimicked in a, maybe you could say, Disney-ish way. You know, caricatures of the style are used when they shouldn't be, really, because then it confuses the authenticity of the district. But I don't know how directly that's tied to Disney in any way.
Yeah, this is John, I'll add to that as well. And one of the most common features I tend to see in districts is the use of ghost signage that wasn't really there before. And I wouldn't say that Disney necessarily directly influenced that, but there is a lot of ghost signage, what I would call fake ghost signage at Disneyland. And a lot of our districts follow that sort of same template in terms of making things look old, even though that signage was never there.
I just keep thinking of the brick pavers. There is one part of, at least at the Magic Kingdom, that it's a side street and you go off to the right. And it is the only part of Main Street USA that I've found that has brick pavers. And that has become like the symbol. You know you're in a historic district when you hit brick pavers. I don't know if it's not necessarily a Disney element, but they've certainly noticed that too, and made a point to make sure, just in case you forgot, here's the brick pavers, this is old.
Okay, so maybe we should move on to, I want to make sure all of these questions from the audience are taken up, and let me know if I'm missing anything that's really compelling. But I think those are the main questions we wanted to cover from the audience. Feel free to continue to ask them in the chat box. Now we'll do one more question, and does anybody have a preference between question 2 or question 3? Maybe we'll go into question 3, because I'm not biased, because I did write this question, but I really think it's something we should be asking as historians, and also as just people who are interested in the past, is what sort of responsibility should Disney have? And this question kind of goes into that, in terms of, say hypothetically, Disney had to produce an interpretive program for at least one of their attractions, probably through a mitigation process. And I was interested in hearing both from our audience and from our panelists what sort of attraction you would pick and what story you would tell as a historian that Disney may not be telling currently.
Well, I can certainly speak to this because I already am doing it. In terms of deciding what stories I want to tell on EnchantedArchives.com, the first one that immediately attracted me was the Mark Twain Riverboat, which is an attraction at Disneyland at Rivers of America, and I'm pretty sure you can also ride a similar attraction at the Magic Kingdom and Disney World. I think this Riverboat is a great access point to all sorts of different stories that Disney just doesn't have an interpretive plaque for. So one has to do with explaining, why is the riverboat named after Mark Twain, great American author? I think some folks know that, but most don't. Another has to do with the steamboat labor that would have been required to make that function in the 19th century. And a lot of that labor was enslaved before the Civil War. And so thinking about how Black Americans were using the steamboat to negotiate their status as free or unfree people. Also, the role of the steamboat in Indigenous displacement. These are things that I'm currently working on that are not up on the site yet, but the Mark Twain Riverboat does include some offshore interpretation of Indigenous groups. That's very, very brief. And histories of the environment as well. The Mississippi, the role of the river and that environment in the local, national, and even international economies. So I think just that one attraction on its own provokes a lot of questions amongst park goers that would just be really exciting to answer.
Yeah, I can't agree more with that assessment of providing stories that, you know, Disney has, you could argue, has covered up, and of course they've drawn from stories, but and not necessarily covered up, you know, to intentionally do that kind of thing in an evil way, but are masking, you know, masking through design and masking through, you know, whether it's riverboats or tiki huts or what have you. I mean, we've all touched upon this. I touched upon the stories that you know these designs draw from, and yet they're, you know, that's not, of course, what Disneyland is all about, or Disney World, or and you know, what are we missing? And then when we continue to exist in these sorts of worlds, and what stories are not being told, and I think that's really important. But I'm going to throw out something that you know we really haven't talked about in great detail, just as something. It's more of a question of preservation. I'd pick something that's more personal, and you know, I would think everybody might do that kind of thing. Like, what if we're imagining one building or one part of the park that has to be mitigated in some fashion because Disney has removed it with some sort of new attraction? I might pick something like Space Mountain. And not because of these controversial histories at all, but rather, on the one hand, in Space Mountain, it's not even the one at Disneyland is not even the first one. The Walt Disney World was the first one that was built. But for me, that's my very first memory of Disneyland, was actually the excitement of Space Mountain, which I didn't even go to. I was very young at the time. This is about 1978, 79. And I remember my brother and sister being so excited about lining up really early, getting there as the gates were opening and running to Space Mountain because it was such a huge attraction at the time and it had just been built, and wanting to make sure that they got on and didn't have to wait in a 3-hour line. And remembering that story, and later on, many years later, I went back to Space Mountain, but thinking about that experience, the excitement of that, the connection between the space race and, of course, the roller coaster, new technologies, everything that's being offered in Tomorrowland. That time period is not even 50 years old yet. And so it's raising those questions as well. Like, why would we mitigate? Why would we tell stories about this? This is not really important in terms of everything that, and yet it's, for me and probably for many people, we all have our own particular memories about something that might need to be preserved because of the significance that we associated with it at one particular time. And you could say, well, that's not really relevant. We're not going to focus on individual memories. We're going to pick but what is Disney if not, a Disneyland, if not a memory of a particular time that we have all sort of crystallized around, if we argue that it's the late 19th and early 20th century, at least with Main Street. Disney's providing that for us, and our downtowns are still, as much as we've appreciated mid-century modern now, are still looking back to more than any other period, going back to the early 20th, late 19th century when we think about redoing or revitalizing our downtown. So I might pick something that in that way becomes more controversial in terms of preservation these days.
Yeah, I would play on a lot of that by saying I think Disney should interpret itself in a way. I was looking at all the Wikipedia pages for the different lands, and there are lists of what used to be there and what's replaced it. Frontierland used to be like a park. There was Conestoga wagon rides, but there was not a lot of actual structural buildings. It was like an open prairie, and you were invited to explore it. I think of even the House of the Future, which I think existed from 1957 to 67. And, the future becomes the past. So it was out of date and obsolete, but wouldn't it be cool for kids these days to know about that and what a feature that was of the park? My mom always talks about it. She thought that was the coolest thing, and now it's gone. So in a way, couldn't Disney kind of interpret its own history and the things that have gone and why they've gone? Because I know a lot of things have been changed based on cultural, popular opinion and current events and things like that, as far as taking out the Native American references, or even I think in the Pirates of the Caribbean, there were men chasing women, so they reversed it and had a woman chasing a man. in one of the dioramas, but things that reflect current cultural thought patterns, and then explain that in their interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, this is John again. I think I was thinking about this question more, and what I would pick very shortly is I would probably go with the Transcontinental Railroad and the exploitation of Chinese workers, and talk about that at Thunder Mountain. So that's my choice. So
I would like to do something. This is Jeanette. That I don't know if it's a thing at the Magic King or at Disneyland, but meeting these characters and going in to see Cinderella and all these princesses is quite a thing. And as the mother of a young girl, I'd love to see a juxtaposition with some like real women pioneers, real women that are doing something amazing instead of just a princess. But that's me.
great choice. It actually surprised me. I don't recall this, but I guess when you had your presentation, it was the one thing that surprised me about Disney is they do have women suffragettes, and they're telling a little bit of history there, but
Little bit, yeah.
yeah, they're not really deeply delving into the big issues. And maybe these issues are too big for kids. Maybe this is a question I'll pose to our panelists: is are these difficult past and difficult histories too much for kids? I remember when I was 14, 15 going to Disneyland, I actually wanted to hear more about the past of these places than just experience them. I wanted to learn more about why they're there, what is the background behind them. And Disney has not, to this point, done much of that. So
well, Disney is more than just for kids. There's a lot of t-shirts. T-shirts are very popular at the Magic Kingdom that says childless millennial. And these are adults who are going to the Magic Kingdom on their own accord with their friends. And so there is an adult population that wants to know more and loves experiencing all things Disney. The kids aren't really going to care until they do, if that makes sense. Like, so having some interpretation for the adults present, providing another layer, would be an interesting way to keep that population engaged.
And I just want to add, a lot of these conversations about kind of difficult histories and what the park is and isn't doing, these are happening on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram, and other places. There's a very robust and exciting online Disney community. And so, accounts dedicated to, for example, describing what used to be at the parks that has since been replaced. And it's very reassuring to someone like me who is trying to offer content that the parks don't. People are interested in it, including very much so these childless millennials, which actually was a major controversy that exploded on social media. So I think one thing that historians and preservationists can do is take those outlets a little more seriously and think about how we can become a part of them.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. And with that, I'm going to close out because I know Phil has to leave around now. So if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me. This goes out to all of our attendees that are still here. And please do leave feedback. I pasted into the chat box, and I'll do it again, the link to our survey. So please leave feedback about today's program. We'd like to hear what you want to see in the future, and we hope you enjoyed today's program. I wanted to thank once again all of our panelists who put some time and effort into these presentations, and I really appreciate your time for our organization on our whole organization's behalf. You allow us to do what we do, so thank you for your time. With that being said, I'm going to turn off the sound, I'm going to turn off the screen share, but I will leave the chat box up, and that'll give you some time to click on that link to leave feedback for us today, so enjoy the rest of your day.